The Convair F-102 Delta Dagger emerged during the Cold War, a period marked by rapid advancements in jet technology and aerodynamics after World War II. This era saw the development of increasingly powerful and streamlined aircraft, making it one of the most exciting times in military aviation. A key concern for Western Europe and the United States was the threat posed by Soviet long-range, nuclear-capable bombers, leading to the creation of interceptors. These aircraft were designed for high-speed engagements, using advanced fire control systems, FCS, to target enemies at a distance with missiles. Initially serving as a deterrent, the F-102 later adapted for limited ground attack roles during the Vietnam War. Despite being operated by only a few nations, the F-102 had a service life of just over 2 decades before its retirement. Though similar in appearance to the later F-106 Delta Dart, the F-102 was more of a transitional interceptor until the F-106 met the original design objectives. In August 1945, as the United States Army Air Force began winding down its World War II operations, there was growing interest in jet-powered aircraft. This led to a requirement for an interceptor with supersonic capabilities. Jet propulsion was still in its early stages during the war, but key technological barriers had been overcome, highlighted by the German Messerschmitt Me-262, the first operational jet fighter. The U.S. Air Force specifications called for a maximum speed of 700 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 50,000 feet to counter Soviet bombers. Convair looked to German engineer Alexander Lippish's work on the Delta Wing design for high-speed flight. Convair, formed in 1943 from the merger of Consolidated Aircraft and Vulcan Aircraft, hence the name Convair, was later acquired by General Dynamics and eventually faded from aviation history. Convair embarked on developing their own Delta Wing design for the U.S. Air Force, designated as the XF-92A. This concept featured highly swept leading wing edges and straight trailing edges, eliminating the horizontal tailplanes typical in traditional aircraft. The experimental airframe first took flight on April 1, 1948. It was powered by a single Allison J-33A29 turbojet engine, producing 7,500 pounds of thrust, allowing for speeds of 718 miles per hour and a service ceiling of 50,750 feet. The fuselage, though streamlined, had a stocky appearance with a triangular vertical tail fin and matching triangular main wings located behind the framed cockpit. Air intake was provided through an open nose. Despite its innovative design, pilots disliked the aircraft due to its violent flight tendencies and underwhelming performance. Ultimately, the USAF concluded the research with the project's formal cancellation. In October 1948, the USAF issued new requirements for an interceptor centered around the cutting-edge MX-1179 Electronic Fire Control System (FCS), designed to manage advanced radar and missile systems. The aircraft needed to achieve Mach 2 speeds and be production-ready by 1954, aiming to equip the USAF with a formidable interceptor to counter Soviet bombers. The project progressed on 2 fronts. Hughes was tasked with developing the FCS, while Convair secured the contract to build the airframe. Drawing on experience from the XF-92 program, Convair introduced the XF-102 prototype, which shared a similar design. The XF-102 bore a strong resemblance to the earlier XF-92, but featured a significantly longer fuselage and larger delta wings. Like its predecessor, all wing surfaces were triangular with pointed tips and swept leading edges. A single engine was housed within the tubular fuselage, while the cockpit was positioned far forward. Though initially intended to use the Wright J67 engine based on the British Bristol Siddeley Olympus, delays led to the temporary choice of the Westinghouse J40 engine. When the J40 project failed, the Pratt & Whitney J57 engine was selected instead. The development of the Advanced MX-1179 Fire Control System (FCS) was also behind schedule, necessitating the installation of the simpler MG3 FCS in the meantime. As such, the XF-102 served as a stepping stone, ironing out technical challenges while the key components continued development. The XF-102 was expected to evolve into the F-102A production interceptor, while the later F-102B model would incorporate the planned FCS and engine. This approach allowed the USAF to field a capable interceptor while waiting for the program's full objectives to be realized, ultimately leading to a more streamlined final product. Like other USAF programs, the XF-102 prototype advanced to the evolution stage as the YF-102. Its first flight took place on October 24, 1953, though the prototype was lost less than 2 weeks later. A second prototype was ready by January of the following year, but showed disappointing performance, unable to break the sound barrier and achieving only subsonic flight. To address these issues, Convair engineers adopted the German wartime-inspired Whitcomb area rule, a design technique that reduced drag in fixed-wing airframes when approaching and exceeding Mach 1. The YF-102 was extensively redesigned, with the fuselage lengthened by 4 feet and pinched at its midpoint. Additionally, a more powerful Pratt & Whitney J57P23 turbojet engine producing 16,000 pounds of thrust was installed and fed by larger, improved air intakes. The wings were further refined, and in this modified state, the YF-102 evolved into the YF-102A. The YF-102A first flew on December 20, 1954, successfully achieving the required supersonic speeds and service ceiling, proving the redesign a success. With the aircraft refined to satisfactory standards, the USAF ordered it into serial production under the name F-102 Delta Dagger. The initial production version, designated F-102A, saw a total of 889 units manufactured by Convair. The F-102's arrival marked the world's first operational production delta-wing supersonic aircraft. Production continued until September 1958. Outwardly, the F-102 projected a sense of speed with its sharp, clean lines and focused design. The fuselage was long and slender, with the cockpit positioned behind a nose cone assembly. Air intakes positioned on either side of the cockpit fed a single engine located at the rear of the fuselage, which ended with an exhaust ring. The delta wing configuration, set on either side of the rounded fuselage, featured highly swept leading edges and straight trailing edges that met at outboard points. A large vertical tail fin resembling a third triangular surface with a clipped tip capped the fuselage spine. The cockpit, a 2-piece installation with framing, provided good forward, side, and upward visibility, although rearward vision was limited by the raised fuselage spine and side intake bulges. As an interceptor rather than a true fighter, extensive cockpit visibility was not a primary design concern. The undercarriage followed a conventional tricycle arrangement with fully retractable gear, 2 main landing gear legs under the wings, and a single nose wheel leg under the cockpit floor. The initial production models were equipped with the Hughes MG3 FCS, while later versions featured the more advanced Hughes MG10 FCS. The F-102 was powered by a single Pratt & Whitney J57P23 turbojet engine, producing 11,700 pounds of thrust. With the afterburner engaged, which involved injecting raw fuel into the engine for temporary speed boosts, At the cost of reduced range, the thrust could increase to 17,200 pounds. This provided the aircraft with a top speed of 825 miles per hour and a service ceiling approaching 54,000 feet, exceeding the original USAF interceptor requirements, though not reaching the Mach 2 speeds initially envisioned. The F-102 had a range of up to 1,350 miles and a rate of climb of around 17,400 feet per minute. As an interceptor, it was designed to quickly ascend to altitude, travel to the interception point at high speed, and deliver ordnance accurately at range. Interestingly, for its time, the F-102 featured weaponry housed in 3 internal bays located under the main fuselage. This decision choice reduced exterior airflow and helped maximize speed, while also somewhat lowering the aircraft's radar signature. As an interceptor, the F-102 was equipped with air-to-air missiles designed to target Soviet bombers. It could carry up to 6 missiles, including a mix of semi-active radar homing AIM-4A Vulcan and infrared homing AIM-4C Vulcan types to address different interception scenarios. Additionally, provisions were made for 24 folding fin aerial rockets, FFARs, in the 2 forwardmost weapon bays, useful for short-range engagements. Weapons management was handled through an additional control column in the cockpit, with the fire control system capable of automatically directing the aircraft to its target. Later in its service, the F-102 was adapted to carry the AIM-26A nuclear Vulcan missile, enhancing its deterrent capability against the Soviets. Reflecting the shift in military aviation towards missile technology, the F-102 did not feature an onboard cannon. To extend its operational range, the aircraft commonly utilized drop tanks, one mounted under each wing. As the Delta Wing fighter was a new addition to the U.S. Air Force, Convair developed a 2-seat trainer variant of the F-102, designated the TF-102A. This trainer retained combat capabilities but had reduced performance due to a revised, bulged front fuselage necessary for side-by-side seating of a student and instructor. A total of 111 TF-102As were produced and extensively used for training all F-102 operators. The F-102 was finally delivered to the U.S. Air Force in April 1956, 2 years later than the planned operational date. New pilots were trained using the TF-102A trainer models. The F-102s served with the U.S. Air Force Air Defense Command until 1960, focusing on defending the continental United States from Soviet air threats. The aircraft were not used in combat until American involvement in the Vietnam War, where every available aircraft was pressed into service to support South Vietnam against communist forces. The F-102s arrived in Vietnam in 1962, initially used for their speed as interceptors and repainted in the Southeast Asia camouflage pattern. Later, they were used as fighter escorts for the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress bombers. As the conflict evolved, the F-102s and the TF-102 trainers were adapted for ground attack roles, carrying high-explosive rocket ordnance. The F-102 remained in the Vietnam theater until 1968, with only 1 loss to enemy air-to-air combat and a total of 15 F-102s lost during the war. As the F-102's peak years passed, many of the airframes were converted into piloted and pilotless target drones for weapons training. Initial conversions began in 1973, with a total of 217 aircraft modified under the designations QF-102A and later PQM-102A through B. The last F-102 drone was destroyed in 1986, providing valuable live-fire training for USAF pilots. There was also a lesser-known proposed strike variant of the F-102, designated the F-102C if produced. This variant was to be equipped with the J-57P-47 engine, an internal gun for close-range combat, and a pair of hardpoints under the wings for conventional drop ordnance. An internal refueling probe and larger internal fuel stores would have extended its operational range. 2 YF-102C prototypes were developed, but the variant was never implemented. The F-102 saw limited overseas deployment, with units delivered to U.S. allies in Turkey and Greece. Turkey received 50 F-102A aircraft and trainers starting in 1968, using former U.S. Air Force models until their service ended in 1979. Greece took delivery of 24 F-102A aircraft and trainers in 1969 and operated them until 1978. The U.S. Air Force officially retired the F-102 from interceptor service in 1976. It served with various commands, including Air Defense Command, Alaskan Air Command, the United States Air Forces in Europe, the Pacific Air Forces, and the Air National Guard. At its peak, the F-102 equipped over 70 interceptor squadrons, with 26 active under Air Defense Command. The rise of more versatile, multi-role aircraft and advanced ground-launched intercept missiles contributed to the decline of the interceptor as a key component of modern warfare. On December 15, 1959, Major Joe Rogers of the United States Air Force Flight Test Center set a world absolute speed record while piloting an F-106A with the serial number 56-0467. Flying along an 11-mile, 18-kilometer straight trajectory at an altitude of 40,000 feet, 12,192 meters, he achieved a speed of 1,525.95 miles per hour, 2,455.77 kilometers per hour, or Mach 2.39. This surpassed the previous record of 1,484.3 miles per hour, 2,388.95 kilometers per hour, set on October 7, 1959 by Colonel Georgy Moselov of the USSR in a modified Mikoyan YE-63 known as YE-66, a MiG-21 F-13 with an alternative engine, by 34.63 miles per hour or 55.73 kilometers per hour. The Convair F-106 Delta Dart, manufactured by the Convair Division of General Dynamics, served as a supersonic, all-weather delta-wing interceptor aircraft for the United States Air Force from the 1960s until 1988. Developed as a dedicated interceptor, the F-106 earned the title Ultimate Interceptor, designed specifically to intercept and neutralize enemy aircraft, particularly bombers, using the Hughes MA-1 electronic guidance and fire control system. The F-106 Delta Dart remains the last dedicated interceptor in the U.S. Air Force's inventory. Initially conceived as an advanced version of the F-102A Delta Dagger and designated F-102B, the aircraft underwent significant modifications that led to a redesignation as the F-106 in June 1956. Exclusively designed as an interceptor, the F-106 was powered by the Pratt & Whitney J75-17 engine. The single-seat F-106A made its first flight on December 26, 1956, and was delivered to the U.S. Air Force in May 1959. It began its operational service with the Air Defense Command's 539th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at McGuire Air Force Base in New Jersey. The F-106A achieved full operational capability in November 1959 with the 498th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Geiger Air Force Base, Washington. The two-seat F-106B, which retained the F-106A's combat capabilities, first flew on April 9, 1958, and reached initial operational status by July 1960. Production of the F-106 ended in late 1960 with a total of 277 F-106As and 63 F-106Bs built, each costing approximately $5 million. The F-106 Delta Dart served as the primary alert interceptor for the Air Defense Command, tasked with defending against potential Soviet nuclear bomber incursions throughout the 1960s, 1970s, and into the 1980s, until it was replaced by the F-15 Eagle. The last active-duty F-106 was stationed with the 49th Fighter Interceptor Squadron at Griffith Air Force Base, Rome, New York, and was moved to Embark at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona for storage in 1987. The final squadron to operate the F-106 was the 119th Fighter Interceptor Squadron of the 177th Fighter Interceptor Group in Atlantic City, New Jersey Air National Guard, which continued to fly the aircraft until June 1988. The development of the F-106, along with its predecessor, the F-102A, is closely linked to Langley and the development of area ruling in the early 1950s. Area rule is a design technique aimed at reducing drag at transonic speeds, evident in the Coke bottle or wasp waist fuselage shape of the F-106. This technique allowed the YF-102A to surpass the speed of sound, setting the stage for the more advanced F-106. Richard T. Whitcomb, the innovator behind area ruling, received the prestigious Collier Trophy from the National Aeronautic Association in 1955 for his groundbreaking work, which was recognized as the most significant achievement in aeronautics that year. The F-106 Delta Dart was powered by a single Pratt & Whitney J75 P17 turbojet engine, producing 16,100 pounds of thrust and 24,500 pounds with afterburner. The first F-106A, serial number 56-0451, was completed by the end of 1956. Its maiden flight, conducted by Convair test pilot Richard L. Johnson at Edwards Air Force Base on December 26, 1956, encountered several problems. The flight had to be cut short due to fluctuations in the air turbine motor frequency and malfunctioning speed brakes, preventing the aircraft from reaching supersonic speeds. The second aircraft, serial number 560452, took its first flight on February 26, 1957. Both aircraft were equipped with the YJ75P1 engine. The initial F-102B, F-106, YF-106A, with serial number 56-0451, was transported from Convair's facility in San Diego to AFFTC Edwards Air Force Base, California, on December 14, 1956, and began taxi tests on December 22, 1956. Its maiden flight on December 26, 1956, was limited to a 20-minute duration, reaching altitudes of 30,000 feet and speeds of 0.8 Mach without afterburner. This performance was comparable to that of an F-102 Delta Dagger taking off with afterburner. The F-106B, serial number 57-2507, built by Convair, completed its taxi test at AFFTC Edwards Air Force Base, California on April 8, 1958. Its inaugural flight took place on April 10, 1958, with Fitzpatrick at the controls. This flight was notable for lasting 50 minutes, nearly twice as long as the F-106A's initial flight, and it reached higher altitudes and faster supersonic speeds than typical for a maiden flight. This performance was likely due to the proven reliability of the F-106A, as the F-106B was very similar in design. On December 15, 1958, Major Joseph W. Rogers set a world speed record in a Delta Dart, reaching 1,525.96 miles per hour, or 2,455.79 kilometers per hour, at an altitude of 40,500 feet, or 12,300 meters. Later that year, Charles E. Myers piloted an identical model and achieved a speed of 1,544 miles per hour, or 2,484 kilometers per hour. The F-106A, with serial number 56-0459, was initially chosen for the record attempt and is often cited in historical accounts as the aircraft that set the record. However, this aircraft faced engine compressor stall issues, severe yaw oscillations, and problems with the variable engine air intake controls just hours before the record attempt, which led to its grounding. The standby aircraft, serial number 56-0467, had not undergone any specialized preparations except for modifications to the limit screws on both the engine and afterburner fuel controls to allow over-limit operation by the pilot. Major Rogers flew this backup aircraft, setting a new speed record. He reported reaching Mach 2.43 and was still accelerating at the end of the course. This record stood until November 22, 1961, when it was surpassed by a McDonnell F-4H-1F Phantom with Lieutenant Colonel R.B. Robertson, a fellow member of the United States Air Force Flight Test Center, achieving a new world speed record. Although the F-106 is still recognized for holding the world speed record for single-engine aircraft, there have been Soviet claims that they surpassed this record on July 7, 1962. According to these claims, Colonel Georgy Mosilov of the USSR flew a single-engine Mikoyan Gurevich YE-166, a variant of the YE-152, designated specifically for this attempt, and reached a speed of 1,665.98 miles per hour, or 2,680.92 kilometers per hour. However, this claim has never been verified. Early operations of the F-106 were plagued by technical issues, including generator defects, fuel flow problems, particularly in cold weather, and combustor starter malfunctions. In December 1959, all F-106s were temporarily grounded following an incident where the canopy was accidentally jettisoned mid-flight on one of the aircraft. The F-106 Delta Dart did indeed benefit from extensive modifications and retrofits by early 1961, which addressed many of the initial issues and improved its performance and reliability. The aircraft's unique design and capabilities made it a favorite among pilots despite the early challenges. The F-106 was deployed in various strategic locations, including the contiguous United States, Alaska, and Iceland, reflecting its role in defending against potential Soviet threats. Its brief deployments in Germany and South Korea also highlight its versatility and the broader scope of its operational reach. Indeed, the F-106 Delta Dart was the second highest numbered PF aircraft under the old numbering system, just behind the F-111. This high numbering reflected its advanced status and significant role in the interceptor category. The nickname The Six became more commonly used than Delta Dart, partly due to its ease of reference and the aircraft's association with the number 6 in its designation. The introduction of the F-106 led to the retirement of older interceptors like the F-86 Sabre and the F-89 Scorpion, making a transition to more advanced interceptors. The F-106 did not see combat in Vietnam, and no foreign sales were made, which kept it within U.S. forces. The aircraft's operational history remains notable for its role in air defense and its advanced design features for its time. Operation High Speed was a pivotal evaluation that showcased the strengths and weaknesses of the F-106A and the F-4B Phantom. The F-4 Phantom's capability to carry a substantial bomb load and a variety of missiles, along with its advanced avionics and multi-role versatility, gave it a clear edge over the F-106A, which was designed primarily as a dedicated interceptor. In the late 1960s, the F-4 Phantom began to serve as an escort and eventually took over from the F-105 Thunder Chief. Its broader operational capabilities made it an invaluable asset for both air-to-air and air-to-ground missions. Throughout its service, the F-106 Delta Dart underwent continuous upgrades to maintain its effectiveness as a premier interceptor. These included significant improvements in avionics to keep pace with evolving threats, as well as modifications to the wing to include a conical camber, which enhanced performance in handling its supersonic speeds. The integration of an infrared search and track system further improved its target acquisition and tracking capabilities in all weather conditions. Additionally, the introduction of streamlined supersonic wing tanks extended the aircraft's range without greatly affecting its performance. These enhancements ensured that the F-106 remained a formidable interceptor throughout its service, even as newer aircraft like the F-4 Phantom began to assume its role. The F-106 Delta Dart was equipped with advanced instrumentation, including an in-flight refueling receptacle for extended range and an arrestor hook for emergency landings. In air-to-air combat assessments, the F-106 demonstrated competitive capabilities against the F-4 Phantom II, particularly in dogfights. Its superior high-altitude turning performance and overall agility were attributed to its lower wing loading, allowing it to outmaneuver the Phantom in certain situations. The F-4 Phantom II had several advantages over the F-106 Delta Dart. It was equipped with advanced radar, operated by an additional crew member, and could carry up to 4 radar-guided AIM-7 Sparrow missiles and 4 infrared AIM-9 Sidewinder missiles. In contrast, the AIM-4 Vulcan missiles used by the F-106 were less effective in dogfighting scenarios, particularly during the Vietnam War. The Phantom also had a higher thrust-to-weight ratio, superior climbing capabilities, and better high-speed and low-altitude maneuverability. Additionally, it can be employed as a fighter-bomber, a versatile role that the F-106 could not match. The combat experiences in Vietnam highlighted the need for improved pilot visibility and the effectiveness of an integrated gun, features that were added to the E variant of the USAF Phantoms. To address some of these shortcomings, Project 6-Shooter in 1972 saw several F-106As upgraded with a new canopy that eliminated metal bracing, thereby significantly enhancing pilot visibility. In addition to these upgrades, the F-106 Delta Dart was fitted with an optical gun sight and provisions for an M61 Vulcan 20mm cannon. This cannon, housed in the central weapons bay and supplied with 650 rounds of ammunition, replaced the AIM-26 Super Falcon or Genie missile. The transition to the F-15 Eagle began in 1981, leading to the allocation of most F-106s to Air National Guard units. The F-106 continued to serve in various U.S. Air Force and Air National Guard units until 1988. Between June 1, 1983 and August 1, 1988, the Delta Darts were gradually retired and moved to the Military Storage and Disposition Center in Arizona. When there was a need for high-performance, full-scale aerial target drones, the USAF began withdrawing these aircraft from storage. Starting in 1986, 194 surplus F-106s were converted into target drones and designated QF-106As. Under the Pacer 6 program, the F-106 Delta Darts were repurposed as target drones by the Aerial Target Squadron. These drones retained the capability to be flown as manned aircraft for ferrying to test sites, but were operated unmanned during tests. The final QF-106 was destroyed in January 1998. The QF-106 drones replaced the QF-100 Super Sabre drones. The last QF-106, serial number 57-2524, was shot down at Holloman Air Force Base on February 20, 1997, and was subsequently replaced by the QF-4S and QF-4E Phantom II drones. On February 2, 1970, during a routine training flight involving aerial combat maneuvers, an F-106 Delta Dart went into a flat spin. First Lieutenant Gary Faust, the pilot, made multiple attempts to regain control, including deploying the aircraft's drag chute as a last resort. Despite his efforts, he was unable to recover the aircraft and was compelled to eject at an altitude of 15,000 feet or 4,600 meters. The ejection of the pilot led to a reduction in the aircraft's weight and a shift in its center of gravity. Additionally, the propulsive force from the ejection seat pushed the aircraft's nose downward. These factors combined to help the aircraft, which had been trimmed for takeoff and was at idle throttle, recover from the spin. Faust landed in the nearby mountains and was rescued by locals on snowmobiles. The local sheriff and residents approached the crash site where the still idling jet engine was causing the plane to drift slowly across the field. A recovery crew from McClellan Air Force Base was then dispatched to dismantle the minimally damaged aircraft for transportation. It is said that an officer from the recovery crew commented that, had the aircraft been even less damaged, he would have flown it out of the field himself. After its unintended landing, the aircraft, nicknamed the Cornfield Bomber, was restored and returned to service with the 49th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, the last Air Force unit to deploy the F-106. In 1979, Faust had the opportunity to pilot the aircraft again during training at Tyndall Air Force Base. The aircraft was eventually retired and donated to the National Museum of the United States Air Force in August 1986, where it continues to be showcased.
In December 1951, after Lockheed Corporation aircraft designer Clarence Kelly Johnson returned from meetings with U.S. Air Force pilots fighting over Korea, he was committed to developing the world's fastest and highest-flying fighter. The specifications for the Lockheed Starfighter were finalized in 1952, and it took its inaugural flight in 1954. The last F-104 to be produced rolled off the assembly line in 1983. In the early 1950s, with the Korean War imposing new demands on U.S. aircraft, designers were faced with a challenge regarding the available engines. A new era of engine technology was in its infancy, with development still at very preliminary stages and timelines for availability uncertain. Consequently, the designers faced a dilemma, whether to proceed with the currently available but somewhat limited power plants or to await the potentially lighter and more powerful engines still in development. At Lockheed, under the leadership of Kelly Johnson, renowned for heading one of the world's premier design teams, the approach oscillated between lightweight concepts utilizing existing jet technology and significantly heavier, more potent designs based on anticipated advancements in engine capabilities. Johnson's association with Lockheed began during the Electra's development, where he supervised certain wind tunnel tests at the University of Michigan. His keen insights and constructive critiques of the new aircraft drew the attention of Lockheed engineers. He was hired by the company, and it was his work on developing the Electra and the subsequent Hudson bomber into success stories that gave him a rapid rise. His innovative and intuitive work brought great rewards for the company. The P-38, with its unorthodox long-range capabilities and enjoyable flying experience, exemplified his unconventional approach to design solutions. It proved both a successful aircraft and a profitable venture, manufactured in significant quantities. The distinctive twin booms of lightning symbolize the pace and daring of aviation development in the 1930s. However, with the conclusion of the war, activity slowed considerably, particularly in military aviation, with the most attention focused on new jet engines and civil aviation, albeit with limited funding. Contrary to the post-war trend in many countries, the USSR continued to advance rapidly in fighter plane design. A plethora of new designs emerged, although some proved inadequate initially. Eventually, Russia began producing highly impressive military aircraft in large quantities. The prevailing Western perception that Russians lagged behind in design and industrial competence was shattered when MiG-15s appeared in the skies over Korea, surprising many with their advanced capabilities. Under pressure to contend with the MiGs and their Sabres, U.S. pilots clamored for revolutionary aircraft to regain the advantage they had previously taken for granted. After numerous visits to Korea, Kelly Johnson heard firsthand from pilots who urgently demanded a new plane surpassing the Russians in altitude and speed, and they needed it promptly. This directive settled the debate on Lockheed's next project. Recognizing the necessity for a high-altitude, high-speed aircraft, Johnson envisioned a lightweight fighter. Rapidly, he focused on what would become the F-104's most contentious design feature, its remarkably small and thin wing. This departure from conventional design principles, including the abandonment of highly swept shapes favored for supersonic flight, marked a significant departure from prevailing thought. Extensive wind tunnel testing ensued, exploring countless variations around the core concept. Much of this testing concentrated on validating the wing, as numerous doubts were raised about its viability. Skeptics questioned whether the wing could fly at all, whether it could withstand the stresses of high-speed flight, and whether it could carry any meaningful payload, even if it could cope with the speed. It was to be only 7 feet long and to go from being just over 4 inches thick at the fuselage down to under 2 inches thick at the tip. Innovative boundary layer control techniques were implemented to generate sufficient lift within a compact area, enabling short landing distances, albeit without internal provisions for guns or wheels. Numerous aspects of the design underwent rigorous examination in supersonic wind tunnel tests. Of particular focus were the air intakes, where efforts were concentrated on demonstrating that shock waves around the inlets facilitated a controllable and reliable supply to the engines. Recorded footage captured shock waves around the muddle during tests conducted near Mach 2, aimed at determining pressure loads of the ducting under various flight conditions. In addition to wind tunnel testing, the F-104's design was subjected to unconventional trials, involving models mounted on 5-inch Army rockets and was launched across desert terrain. These tests effectively simulated the stress of high speeds and accelerations experienced at lower altitudes, providing insight into both wing shape and construction techniques. Despite their unconventional nature, these rocket firings proved invaluable for the engineering team, facilitating assessments of wing performance and construction under extreme conditions. Similar tests were conducted on the tail, which, like the wing, was designed to be exceptionally thin, prompting skepticism regarding its strength. Once again, these tests proved instrumental in optimizing the design. Within a brief development period, hundreds of models were constructed and tested, allowing for continuous refinement of the aircraft's key components. Generally little or nothing was added to the original plane, and with the F-104's appearance settled, a contract was issued for 2 planes to be built. The fabrication process commenced with the construction of 3 fuselage modules at full scale, while simultaneously, jigs were assembled to support the entire aircraft structure. Throughout the workshop, activities such as drilling, milling, and cutting of parts began in earnest. The aircraft, produced on an experimental production run, were essentially crafted by hand. Following the receipt of the March 1953 contract, Lockheed swiftly cleared production space, erected a wooden mock-up, and seamlessly transitioned to building the 2 prototypes without interruption. Remarkably, the first flight was scheduled to occur just 12 months after the contract was signed. The achievement within this short time frame was truly astonishing. Unlike designs that had been in development for an extended period, this aircraft came into existence in late 1952, representing a significant leap forward in aviation technology. Despite its advanced nature, its development proceeded at an extraordinary pace. The unconventional wing design, bolted to the fuselage rather than passing through it as with most contemporary fighters, was secured on with heavy-duty precision-forged aluminum fittings, integrating seamlessly within the wing's skins. Johnson's design, though straightforward in some respects, resulted in an aircraft that could soar higher and faster than the MiGs, effectively creating a manned missile. Even the retractable undercarriage, which folded into the fuselage in a fairly complex manner, underwent meticulous testing beyond the norm. The Air Force had no legal document calling for submission of a design anything like the 104, and without the prestige of Lockheed and Kelly Johnson, they may have simply rejected it. Despite the bold claims of anticipated performance, the concept was deemed both logical and exhilarating, leaving no alternative but to proceed with the issuance of the March 1953 contract. While there was no apparent existing slot in inventory for such an aircraft, the lessons learned from the Korean War suggested a compelling argument for its necessity. Nevertheless, the F-104 remained firmly under scrutiny, subject to rigorous evaluation. Construction of the aircraft progressed swiftly, with major subassemblies swiftly coming together, followed by vibration testing conducted at Lockheed's facilities. This testing aimed to establish the natural frequency patterns of entire structure, ensuring its safety for flight. Under tight security, the F-104 prototype departed the Lockheed plant on early morning of February 25, 1954, bound for Edwards Air Force Base. Upon arrival, crews immediately commenced a thorough series of checks and rechecks on the aircraft systems and meticulous preparation for its maiden flight. The engine selected for the prototypes was the Wright J65, which was to prove very inadequate in propelling the 104, Eden light though it was. The majority of production starfighters were equipped with a General Electric J79 engine, renowned for its higher thrust-to-weight ratio, poised to propel the F-104 beyond twice the speed of sound. As the first flight approached, the rigorous pace of testing persisted, with the engine undergoing thorough run-ups and final preparations. Despite a minor incident during taxi trials on February 28th, when test pilot Tony Levier experienced a brief skip, the F-104 was officially rolled out for its inaugural flight on March 4, 1954. Levier conducted a series of ground tests, ensuring the proper operation of flight controls and systems before confidently taking off for the first time. In the ensuing weeks of test flights, it became apparent that the power plant was unable to fully unleash the Mach 2 potential of the airframe. Nevertheless, the concept of the lightweight fighter was unequivocally validated. Despite the prototype's inability to surpass 1.3 times the speed of sound with this existing engine, the design was deemed successful enough for the Air Force to order 15 additional planes with upgraded power plants designated as F-104A models. In April 1955, one of these finally took the Starfighter past Mach 2, which was the signal for F-104 production to swing into top gear. For the moment, the intense testing of the two prototypes continued. Both prototypes, depicted here flying in tandem, met tragic ends during the prolonged and troubled test period. Numerous incidents occurred, revealing flaws in the aircraft's engine and equipment, often occurring in situations of significant or imminent danger. In one such early mishap in 1955, Tony Levier encountered trouble while testing the firing of the Starfighter's high-speed cannon during supersonic flight. Following an initially successful firing, Levier prepared for another run to test the gun once more. However, during this attempt, a catastrophic failure occurred, resulting in a complete loss of engine power. With quick thinking, Levier, approximately 40 miles from base, assessed his options. Despite being theoretically high enough to glide back to land, he knew that he had to act swiftly. he approached the lower limits for safe ejection from the aircraft. Before even opening match, a telltale smudge of smoke on the fuselage indicated that the gun had caused the issue. Inspection revealed a hole in the gun compartment caused by a cartridge ejecting backward to the gun baseplate. Relieved to find the malfunction confined to the gun rather than the airframe, engineers promptly rectified the issue, allowing testing to resume. The Starfighter's gun was the Vulcan M61 cannon. 6 feet long and 300 pounds in weight, it was, at that time, claimed to be the fastest firing gun of its type in the world. The M61 cannon boasted an impressive firing rate of 6,000 20mm cannon shells per minute. Drawing inspiration from the renowned Gatling gun, patented as far back as 1862, the M61 incorporated 2 key features: a rotating cluster of barrels and external propulsion. By rigidly clamping 6 barrels together, the design provided mutual support, minimalizing the whip effect seen in single-barrel configurations and centralizing recoil. Unlike the hand-crank Gatling guns of the Civil War era, the M61 was powered electrically by the aircraft, eliminating the need to capture and utilize gun exhaust. This innovation reduced susceptibility to corrosion and fouling, each round fired independently, negating the erratic recoil associated with multi-gun and gas-reloaded systems. Considering the challenges encountered in the early days of integrating the M61 with the F-104, it's important to view these issues as part of the expected learning curve with any advanced equipment. Comparing the M61 Vulcan to the U.S. Air Force's previous preference for machine guns presents difficulties in terms of hitting power, firing rate, and the influence of aircraft dynamics on the gun's operation and overall effectiveness. The Vulcan outstripped previous options to such a degree that meaningful evaluation becomes irrelevant, even with consideration of multiple machine gun installations. In contrast to Kelly Johnson's initial assessment, the military procurement policies of the era demanded multi-role capability. Consequently, despite the F-104's origins as a specialized single-function fighter, provisions were developed to allow it to carry a variety of weapons. While the Starfighter's exceptional performance was acknowledged by the USAF, it wasn't deemed sufficient justification for the project. Lockheed was compelled to explore unconventional attachments for the aircraft in an attempt to persuade the Air Force to continue with the program. One such innovation was the trapeze installation designed to facilitate the carriage and delivery of the Genie nuclear rocket. This ingenious launching mechanism was another manifestation of Kelly Johnson's intuition. When faced with the challenge of ensuring the aircraft could deliver the device over a combat radius of 650 miles, Johnson committed to achieving this within a mere 60 days. Given the already limited space within the Starfighter's fuselage, one of the primary considerations in designing the launcher was ensuring it didn't interfere with the undercarriage. Despite these challenges, the F-104 successfully demonstrated firings of the Genie at altitudes of 56,000 feet and speeds exceeding 1.7 times the speed of sound. However, the aircraft's ability to meet such challenges ultimately did little to sway the Air Force's eventual assessment. Lockheed conducted tests with various weapons delivery attachments and external fuel tanks, aiming to enhance the plane's range and versatility. Despite these efforts, the project faced mounting opposition, and the weight of opinion against it continued to grow. The 104 was very much in the right place at the wrong time. The F-104 Starfighter defied the prevailing trends in the aircraft design of its time. While other fighters were growing in size to accommodate more functionalities, Kelly-Johnson opted to strip down the aircraft to its essential components, aiming to achieve Mach 2 speeds with a single afterburning turbojet engine. However, this approach ultimately limited the Starfighter's career with the USAF. There simply wasn't enough space within the aircraft to accommodate the rapidly expanding hardware requirements of radars, aiming controls, and other advanced avionics systems. Despite its unmatched capabilities, which surpassed those of its heavier counterparts, the Starfighter's versatility was often overlooked amidst the general disdain towards lightweight fighters. Criticisms focused on its lack of all-weather capability, lifting power, and range, ultimately leading to the discussion to phase it out of service. The project was set for financial failure, but the work that had started on giving the F-104 greater versatility went on apace, trying to forestall the inevitable and keep the Air Force involved in the plane. The F-104 Starfighter boasted a formidable weapons capability, including standard systems such as the Sidewinder air-to-air Bisarl. It was widely acknowledged as an effective firing platform, excelling in its designated role-to-air superiority and proving itself to be lethally efficient, akin to a stiletto. From the outset, the Air Force maintained a cautious stance towards the F-104. It was the first aircraft to be procured on a fixed-then-fly basis. Prior to this, the Air Force had typically accepted new aircraft into service while they were still undergoing testing, adhering to the flying and then fixed principle. However, given the radical nature of the F-104, the responsibility for testing and rectifying issues was shifted back to the manufacturer, a practice that has since become standard due to the complexity of modern combat aircraft. As the likelihood of significant USAF orders diminished, a new market quietly emerged in Europe. The remarkable performance of the F-104, coupled with its rapidly expanding tactical capabilities, solidified its reputation as the benchmark design in its class. Despite initial reservations, the F-104's prowess ensured its continued relevance and appeal on its international stage. On top of the expansion and weaponry of the plane, during 1958 and 1959, it was set on a spree of record 7 to reinforce the message of its potency. Even when the new F-4 Phantom II broke some of the Starfighter's records, the F-104 promptly set new marks outside the F-4's ability. In order to address criticism regarding its limited range, the F-104 Starfighter incorporated in-flight refueling technology, a relatively new concept at the time. Considerable effort and resources were invested in integrating this capability into the aircraft. The F-104 had to demonstrate capabilities in ordnance, range, and technical sophistication, features that were initially excluded from the designer's original considerations, but were now essential to meet the potential specifications set by the Western and Luftwaffe. To secure large-scale sales, the aircraft had to overcome the same challenges set by the USAF. It needed to evolve into a multi-role, all-weather strike aircraft and excel in the tasks assigned to it, including seemingly straightforward tasks such as aerial refueling. The German order became increasingly significant, necessitating various unexpected capabilities from the aircraft, such as an enhanced barrier landing strength. The Luftwaffe sought the ability to deploy aircraft away from bases in times of conflict. While the F-104 demonstrated the necessary strength to handle artificially shortened landings, the challenge for the pilots in executing these maneuvers was considerable and posed additional hurdles. In the long term, there were to be few performance targets set for the F-104 that it could not cope with. There was always an uncertainty regarding whether the individual pilots would be able to handle the F-104 effectively, and the necessity for specific training of the pilots for the F-104 signaled a shift in aviation training practices, foreshadowing trends that would become more prevalent in the future. While a properly trained pilot flying a well-maintained F-104 was not at risk, the combination of an unprepared pilot and the aircraft could prove to be lethal. The survival of the Starfighter became contingent upon sales in the overseas markets, with the development of the aircraft driven by the specified and perceived needs of NATO clients. For example, if Germany required short takeoff and landing capabilities, Lockheed would showcase successful crash barrier landings and zero-length launch capabilities. In one instance, the truck-mounted rocket-propelled launch system was demonstrated with an F-84. Both unmanned and pilot launches were executed satisfactorily. Although this development didn't yield any immediate practical applications, the potential for successful employment with the Starfighter was seen as a valuable asset to the project in the eyes of the Luftwaffe. With West Germany being the border between Eastern and Western spheres of influence, it was essential that no less than the other European states she retrieve her power as a military force, not only in weaponry, but in industrial capacity. Unlike the aftermath of the First World War, there was a perceived need for a strong Germany within the Western Alliance, and Germany's concerns became pivotal considerations for the strategists at Lockheed working on selling the F-104. Given NATO's need for new weaponry and the desire to standardize armaments across a number of countries, focusing on Germany's potential requirements was a logical approach. If Lockheed could fulfill Germany's call for new equipment, it was anticipated that many others would follow suit. Although the F-104 never saw regular use of rocket-assisted takeoffs, 104Ns were utilized for exposing potential astronauts to hydrogen peroxide thrust controls at altitudes exceeding 100,000 feet. One of the developments that revitalized the F-104's concept was the introduction of the two-seat variant. It was customary for U.S. fighters to have a trainer or reconnaissance version with 2 seats, and the F-104 followed suit. While the Germans primarily sought a ground strike aircraft, they also desired a versatile platform, prompting serious consideration of a twin-seat variant. As part of Lockheed's sales strategy, a production offset package was proposed, involving the manufacturing of planes by consortia of European aviation companies. This approach aimed to not only secure sales but also foster collaboration and investment within European aerospace industries. The shot in arm for European aerospace capability from the construction of these new factories was one of the declining factors in the successful campaign. The plane itself performed very well. In the fly-offs, the F-104's superiority over the other contenders was evident, almost to the point of being a walkover. The competition for the contract was fierce, with some highly capable aircraft, notably the British Lightning, among the contenders. However, political considerations seemed to have played a role, and by the time the contract was awarded, the F-104 had demonstrated itself as the standout performer. Despite its unquestionable performance, the F-104's reputation as a high-performance aircraft had its drawbacks. Its demanding nature meant that it could be unforgiving to inexperienced or careless pilots. There were strict limits on what a pilot could push the F-104 to do. Over the course of the development period, which was plagued by various challenges, over 8,000 flights were conducted in the test series using 52 aircraft. Unfortunately, several aircraft were lost due to equipment malfunctions and pilot errors. The F-104 represented a convergence of 2 eras in aviation technology, with much of the technology being new and untried. This juxtaposition is illustrated humorously by the sight of the F-104's streamlined nose attached to the front of a DC-3 during avionics testing. While the F-104 was not the first U.S. designated aircraft to prioritize lightweight and compact design, its development marked a significant step forward in this regard. For instance, the Bell XP-77 had nearly entered production during the Second World War, demonstrating a similar focus on lightweight design principles. Their win, too, was not without precedent, being very similar to that of the X-3. The F-104 Starfighter was undeniably revolutionary in many aspects, yet as the program progressed, it became mired in controversy, much of which extended beyond issues with the airframe itself. This controversy led to the unfair dismissal of the Starfighter as a lemon. The USAF withdrew its F-104s from operational service after just 2 years, although some were later deployed during the Vietnam War, primarily serving as high-flying escorts for B-52s and IMBO-level tactical support strikes. Meanwhile, the USSR, having learned valuable lessons from the Korean War, developed a MiG-17 in response to changing combat requirements. Unlike the F-104, which prioritized speed and climb performance, the MiG-17 was designed as a short-range interception fighter with high-speed capabilities, rapid climb rates, and agile maneuverability. Equipped with air-to-air missiles, internal cannon, and a light ground support bomb load, the MiG-17 was essentially an updated version of the MiG-15, featuring improved handling and more swept-wing design. Despite being considered theoretically obsolete upon its proposal, the MiG-17 proved to be a highly effective aircraft. U.S. thinking was totally different. If we ignore the F-104 and look at the other Sentry fighters, we find that they were all much larger planes. They also shared a commitment to state-of-the-art technology with varying degrees of success. The F-100 Super Sabre, F-101 Voodoo, F-102-106 Delta Dagger Delta Dart also limited service in Vietnam and eventually faded into history. Each of these aircraft, in its own way, epitomized the concept of the fighter as a standoff missile launch platform. Initially conceived as specialized aircraft for specific roles within the fighter spectrum, such distinctions blurred over time as each aircraft evolved to possess multi-role capabilities. The F-100 and F-101, in particular, diversified into different roles as their careers progressed. Among the Sentry series aircraft, it is doubtful that any could have effectively countered the F-104 Starfighter. Even many more modern aircraft would have struggled against the F-104's capabilities. The overseas sales program for the F-104 not only saved the project from financial disaster, but also turned it into a remarkable success for Lockheed. With production deals in place, the F-104 entered service with 14 air forces, becoming one of the closest approximations to its standard Western fighter plane. Customized fire control systems and other controls tailored for each country's version of the F-104 allow for versatile use in various roles. Despite its reputation for demanding respect and care from pilots, the F-104 also gained renown as one of the most formidable aircraft in the air. Customer air forces around the world employed the F-104 in diverse roles and continued its development until the last ones were built in 1983. As presumably everybody knows, the Germans, whose orders had been so critical, initially had a fairly miserable time with the plane, losing over 200 of them in accidents. The reason for this are many, but little blame can be appointed to the plane itself. The early deployment disaster with the Luftwaffe had complex roots, and it took time to address the underlying causes. The West Germans experienced a similar, albeit shorter, struggle when introducing the F-104 into their inventory. However, none of the other nations that purchased a Starfighter had experiences remotely resembling the issues faced by Germany. It was evident that the problems primarily stemmed from the specific circumstances within the Luftwaffe at the time. To counter the mounting negative publicity surrounding the F-104, Lockheed maintained its own private Starfighter as a promotional tool. This aircraft flew extensively around the world in search of orders and was later used in PR efforts to salvage the reputation of the plane. In this aircraft, Jackie Conquered, renowned for her achievements in the Bendix races of the 1930s and her service with the Women's Air Force Service Pilots during World War II, became the first female Western pilot to break the speed of sound. Kelly Johnson's design team transitioned from a plane with almost no wing to one with extraordinarily long wings, the U-2 spy plane, and then the remarkable Mach 3 SR-71 Blackbird, showcasing their innovative and groundbreaking approach to aircraft design and engineering. Both of these aircraft bear some superficial resemblances to the 104. Certainly comparing the three to the other planes of their time, it's easy to see them as stablemates, products of the one vision. Kelly Johnson, the mastermind behind these groundbreaking aircraft, retired universally respected as one of the giants of aviation. Throughout his illustrious career, his designs were consistently at the cutting edge of their time, often ahead of their time. One of Johnson's later endeavors was the redesign of the F-104, which became known as the Lancer. This revamped version, featuring larger wings and enhanced maneuverability, was proposed in a fighter competition that ultimately led to the mass production of the F-15. However, the Lancer proposal did not receive serious consideration and no aircraft were built. Johnson maintained that the Lancer would have outperformed the F-15, with some experts agreeing and even suggesting that the F-104 itself could have posed a challenge to the F-15 in an aerial combat. Despite the F-104's early struggles, including engine availability issues and the unreliability of the J79 engine, its testing and development phase set new standards in aviation. Major challenges like pitch-up were overcome through rigorous testing and refinement, resulting in a powerful and reliable, albeit eager and somewhat temperamental aircraft. Despite its enduring reputation for controversy, the F-104 ultimately vindicated the decisions of its creators. Throughout its lengthy career, it carved out a unique and significant place in the annals of aviation history.
This fighter squadron is flying faster than the speed of sound. These pilots engaged in combat miles above the Earth. It was a truly fantastic concept. But when the first F-100 Super Sabres were delivered to the US Air Force in 1953, that fantasy became a reality. Until then, the only planes to have broken the sound barrier were experimental test aircraft. With the arrival of the F-100, the age of supersonic air combat had truly begun. Their arrival wasn't an uneventful one. New planes set two records, the last subsonic world speed record and the first supersonic world speed record. After 4 years of development, the F-100 ushered in a new era. Ahead lay a long, tumultuous career that would be marked by distinction and marred by crashes and controversy. Overcoming the sound barrier was a landmark achievement, and the F-100 marked the dividing line between the first and second generation of jet fighters. Because the Air Force was just reaching the 100s to give as new plane designations, the first assortment of supersonic aircraft were known as the Sentry Fighters. The Sentry Fighters were renowned and included the F-105, but it was from the cockpits of the F-100 Super Sabres that the Thunderbird pilots would eventually choose to perform their aerobatic magic. The plane had its problems, including landing characteristics that were more like a controlled crash, but in flight, its responsiveness and reliability won the affection of the most critical of pilots. Though Super Sabre was the product of a very distinguished design team, the North American company had been quietly successful since its inception. There had been no upheaval in the company since 1935, and within this stable atmosphere, the designers were encouraged to probe the cutting edge of aviation development. The Super Sabre was born in 1949, when the designers began exerting efforts to take the next major step forward, breaking the sound barrier. By the time the F-100 was developed, North American prided itself on having built the greatest fighters of World War II and Korea. Opinions may differ, but the two aircraft in question, the Mustang and the Sabre, would certainly be contenders for the title. As the third fighter from the stable, the F-100 faced the challenge of living up to this legacy. The company's first fighter was a classic. The P-51 Mustang was truly a legend. It had firmly established the company's name in the world of combat aircraft construction. In the European and Pacific theaters, the Mustang made its mark as a superb escort and attack aircraft. The first flown in 1940, it stood at the end of a long line of propeller-driven fighters and was one of the greatest ever flown. But the P-51 remained in service after World War II, overlapping into the developmental age of early jets. It was still in service in large numbers during the Korean conflict and was a mainstay in ground attack and support missions. North American built over 16,000 P-51s. This massive success with their first fighter project served the company well. It established them as a producer of the first-class fighters, filled the company coffers, and set them up to make their next series of design studies. North American was ready to step into the jet age. It did so with two new planes, the FJ-1 for the Navy and the F-86 for the Air Force. By far, the more successful of the two was the Air Force F-86, thus Sabre. By this time, the company was so confident that the F-86 was delayed for over a year, as the company designers sorted out the problems of giving the plane swept wings and a tail. North American stability and prosperity allowed for that kind of risk-taking, and the resulting aircraft richly repaid the company's investment and patience. Sabres went into mass production in 1949, arriving just in time for their baptism by fire in Korea. The F-86 first went into service in Korea in December 1950. By that time, the Air Force had to run into stiff opposition from MiG-15s, which were also clearly outperforming their American jets. In mortal struggles over the Korean landscape, the newly arrived Sabre established combat superiority over the Russian plane. Better training and tactics, along with technology, for what really carried the day. Meanwhile, the Sabre's designers were tackling a new challenge, the sound barrier. Work commenced in 1949 and progressed rapidly through 1950. Early experiments in extending the capability of the Sabre merely revealed the limitations of its design. The engineers quickly returned to a blank sheet of paper, and in the end, developed a totally new and much larger aircraft. In January 1951, the Air Force gave the nod to this new design. Soon after, the F-100 Supersonic Dayfighter was launched into production. No experimental or X aircraft were ever built. In fact, the first F-100s would be a production prototype or Y plane with typical North American confidence. This went from the drawing board to the construction bay 3 months prior to the Air Force approval. Aviation technology was leaping ahead at the time, and the F-100 was quickly outdated. But the jet was too useful for early retirement and complemented new designs throughout the coming year. The Sentry fighters were the core of the U.S. air power for many years. They represented an enormous commitment to advanced technology and immense capital investment. Their development was a construction and reflected the revolutionary advances in aviation theory and practice. They became the testing ground for innovations in many fields: aerodynamics, materials, methods of machining and construction, engines, avionics, navigation, and fuels. All the changes weren't limited to technology. There was also a revolution in tactics and arms. Chief among these were developments in missiles and nuclear weapons. In time, the F-100 found its niche as a fighter bomber. At the outset, it was designed as an air superiority fighter, but soon gained multi-role capability. The wing was redesigned to carry up to 6,000 pounds of stores on 6 pylons. This enabled the Super Sabre to carry a many variety of weapons and ensured that the plane could pack a heavy punch. The Korean stalemate cemented American determination to be fully prepared for future conflicts, and the whole approach to weaponry was reapproached. Machine guns soon gave way to more powerful weapons. Some theorists predicted that the unguided bomb would soon be replaced by missiles. The idea spread, and a number of F-100Ds were altered to accommodate the bullpup tactical air-to-surface missile. This weapon of the future was guided by the pilot with a cockpit toggle. Like early versions of many things, it wasn't terribly effective. Experience would show that the unguided bomb held a considerable cost advantage over complex missiles. The new weapons also proved to be too expensive for widespread use. Still, their relative accuracy was considered essential in some combat situations. Early F-100 days had some major faults. In part, these were due to design changes ordered after the initial contract had been signed during 1952. These changes included a critical shortening of the tail. This left plane with the very bad roll coupling problems, and after 6 major accidents, the F-100s were grounded. 2 pilots died when, through no fault of their own, their plane spun out of control and then broke up. In response to this tragedy, the tail was enlarged to its original shape and the wings extended. These changes were retrofitted to existing planes and incorporated into the new ones when production resumed. Apart from this very major flaw, the test series at Edwards Air Force Base went fairly smoothly. The only other concern focused on the plane's landing characteristics. This was eventually addressed through the pilot training rather than modifications to the plane. Experiments in zero-length launch were also conducted at Edwards. The F-100 had a range of well under 600 miles. It was later given in-flight refueling capability, either from a tanker or the buddy system from tanks on another plane. As a result, it became capable of extended patrols and long-range strikes. 203 F-100As were built, the first 70 being delivered before the roll coupling problems were corrected. Fixing this delayed the program, and it wasn't until the spring of 1955 that production resumed. By that time, the upgraded F-100C was undergoing tests. The B designation had already been committed to a version intended to fly faster than twice the speed of sound. Design problems weren't limited to the potentially fatal control losses experienced at high speeds. At low speeds, the plane could also be very unforgiving. Here, a pilot realized that he has undershot his landing point and frantically attempts to put his plane back up. In opening his throttle too fast, he included a compressor stall and then, in a series of overcorrections, fatally compounded his problem. This incident was not unique, and the term saber dance gained a new and darker meaning. The F-100 design was not necessarily flawed. The problem stemmed from the plane's purpose, which was to go fast, and many of the characteristics essential in going fast inhibit low speed control. The F-100 stalled at around 150 knots. It was sluggish and unresponsive anywhere near that lower speed. The pilot's forward view was seriously obstructed. The throttle of a slowed-down Sabre jet was touching, and landings were never simple. In the end, the F-100's low speed control problems were never fully corrected. It was just another deadly possibility that the pilots had to learn to live with. Training, experience, and the instinct for self-preservation kept the accident rate down, and most buyers found it safer to strain the undercarriage in high-speed landings than to meddle with the F-100 at low speeds. The Super Sabre embodied the demands of supersonic flight, from the sharp lips of its air intake to the sweep of its wings. Even stationary F-100s gave an impression of speed. There were many innovative touches about them. Fully pivoting slab horizontal tail surfaces were positioned as low as possible on the flattened belly of the fuselage. There were no outboard flaps. Instead, a system of leading-edge slats were employed. Throughout its career, the F-100 had the type of problems to be expected of such an advanced design. In some ways, it was an adventurous experiment. North Americans selflessly circulated information about these problems throughout the American aerospace industry. Though it was information obtained through costly research and analysis, the companies passed it on nevertheless. Because of this, the industry as a whole advanced, and mistakes were seldom repeated. North American and most Super Sabre pilots were well pleased with the plane. This included the framed Thunderbird's aerobatic team. This loyalty went very deep. Once, they were issued replacement F-105s, and finding these not up to par, promptly returning them to their Super Sabres. The Thunderbirds flew the F-100s from 1956 until 1969. They started with the first 6 examples of the C model and stayed with the F-100 from then on. Needless to say, they came to know every virtue and every vice that the aircraft had.
Okay, Thunderbirds, let's do a loop. play the deck. Nose coming up. Okay, and with the pull. Right on in. Topping the loop now, ease it off. Let it float a little. All right, back in with the pull. Now let's ease it off and play the deck. Smoke off now.
The Thunderbirds also wrote another sad chapter of the F-100 story. After a crash during one of their air shows, investigators turned up fatigue problems in the wings of the plane. It is suspected that some of the Super Sabres that went down in Vietnam may have lost due to the same flaw. This diagnosis led to immediate remedial action, saving other pilots from a similar fate. The Thunderbird's performances with the Super Sabre are proof that even if practice cannot make perfect, it can come very, very close. These thrilling planes were not specifically built supermodels. They were stock aircraft, maintained and flown for a specific purpose. The Thunderbirds exaggerate and embellish normal maneuvers in a choreographed sequence that appears to push the aircraft into unusual or extreme conditions. But each pilot is a pro, and the test is to match his ability with that of the plane. Because of the high accident rate, a two-seat version, the F-100F, was developed to familiarize pilots with the plane. This effectively transferred the bulk of the accident rate onto the trainers. The F model suffered heavily. Over 1/4 of them were lost in non-combat mishaps. Each airplane imposes its own demands upon a pilot, and the F-100 was the first of a new breed. Because of this, all personnel transferred to it were given an extra intensive training. With the revolutionary advance to supersonic flight, pilots needed to start training all over again, because jets not only greatly increase speeds, but they drastically reduce the pilot's room for error. In combat against Japanese Zeros and North Korean and Chinese MiG-15s, the American military learned that advanced pilot training and tactical discipline can overcome technical disadvantages. The Zeros and MiGs were superior aircraft to many of those pitted against them, but they were frequently outperformed because of their pilots' limited skills. But when an advanced pilot is put into a superior plane, the road to survival and victory is a more certain one. This is what the United States did with the Sentry fighters and their crews. Korea had taught many lessons about aerial warfare. It was learned that strategic campaigns aimed at destroying an opponent's means of production were sometimes of dubious value, especially if your opponent didn't have the means of making war, but rather relied on an outside supplier. It became confident that there was a vast gulf between world war and limited war. In a limited struggle, aerial warfare became a manner of maintaining air superiority, interdicting the enemy's supplies, and supporting ground troops through battlefront strikes. The F-100 became more and more a tactical fighter bomber. There were faster interceptors and more expensive Mach 2 long-range strike aircraft, but the Super Sabre became the primary battlefield support weapon. Only 203 of the Interceptor A models were ever built. The following C model was a fighter bomber, and 476 of these appeared. The fully dedicated attack version, the F-100D, was built in far greater numbers. 1,274 were produced. The C and D models were out-and-out attack aircraft. The combination of high-speed landing and considerable bulk made the F-100 difficult to stop on landing. If the landing chute blew out, the pilot was set for a very long roll. Most of the planes of the era suffered the same problem and relied on long concrete runways. It was just another thing that the fighter pilots at the time had to accept as a part of the job. The company had given the Super Sabre its name, but for many, it was just too much of a mouthful. The planes came to be known by their crew as Huns, a contraction of F-100. Including 2-seat trainers and the 2 prototypes, 2,294 were built. The last of these was delivered in October 1959. From 1957, they equipped 16 U.S. Air Force fighter wings and were a vital weapon in the American arsenal.
When it jumps from its short runway, the plane will accelerate from 0 to 200.
The F-100B project was meant to take advantage of the Hun's reconfiguration into a tactical strike aircraft. The limited speed of the F-100 design, around Mach 1.25, prompted a redevelopment effort to make a plane that could approach Mach 2. Features were added to gear the aircraft for tactical fighter-bomber missions. These features soon came to dominate the design, and included a recess in the hull providing semi-submerged nuclear weapon storage. This innovation was actually rediscovered 30 years later and given the name conformal storage. To safely eject the bombs from this recess, the air intake for the engine was shifted to the top of the fuselage, as it had with the Hun. Tactical consideration came to totally dominate the F-100B. Air Force approval to proceed with the design was given on June 11, 1954. This was followed a month later by the issue of a new designation for the aircraft. The F-100B became the F-107. By that time, the changes had become so radical to the F-107A, really little had left in common with the Hun. The fuselage, in addition to its shark fin intake, was 50% longer than the 100. Like the Super Sabre, the F-107 featured many innovations, including an all-movable vertical tail surface and variable air intake ducts. The plane had also a multitude of built-in equipment, including chaff dispensers, radar beacons, maneuverable autopilot, and computerized stability augmentation. With this avionics package, the F-107A was really a leap into the future of the electronic development. The first F-107A took flight on September 10, 1956, at Edwards Air Force Base. The test series went ahead. Though there were some minor problems evident, North American was increasingly confident that it would all be a hot seller. The 107 was in competition with the Republic F-105, which appeared to be encountering developmental problems and wasn't ready to fly. The fly-offs were postponed. North American referred to the F-107 as the Super Sabre. The biggest worry was that once the 107 won the contract, construction would go to Republic, whose factory had no work of its own. Despite North American's confidence, the decision when announced came down on the side of Republic's F-105. Now, it was obvious that the F-107 would never be built in its numbers. An initial 33 examples had been contracted, but the only 3 test aircraft were fully built. It's said that the 105 won because its internal bomb bay. Although this feature was never really used, the F-107 was left with the bitter consolation of being one of the best planes not to win an Air Force contract. But the F-107's failure didn't negate the F-100's success, and the Super Sabre soon took its place in the front line of the U.S. Air Force. The late 50s and early 60s was a time of peace, and North America took the chance to refine the plane. The F-100B model, which introduced integrated refueling gear, carried an astounding array of non-nuclear stores. Over 75 weapons, bomb racks, ECM pods, and launchers for rockets, mines, flares, and sundry other attachments were compatible with the plane. The D had a number of significant adjustments, including the landing flaps, greater wing area, and a taller tail. Over the years, the C and D models appeared in a number of many variations. With some different cockpit layouts, 148D models were even equipped with zero-length launch. In 1962, an extensive program was begun to standardize the existing Huns. The program took until 1965 to complete, with an average of 60 days spent to modify each plane. But after the refit, Tactical Air Command finally had what it wanted: a fleet of advanced combat-ready F-100s. The F-100 went to war on the 9th of June 1964. Sent to strike a target in the tiny nation of Laos, 8 pilots flying F-100s attacked the path to Laos stronghold in a reprisal raid. This was in retaliation for the shooting down of a Navy reconnaissance plane. It would only be the first of hundreds of missions flown over Southeast Asia, where, time and time again, the plane would prove its worth in battle. From the first raid onward, the Huns' involvement gradually escalated. In March 1965, Operation Rolling Thunder began. The United States had become fully entangled in the conflict, and, as the leading tactical fighter on the spot, so did the F-100. Vietnam lacked landing fields or jet-powered aircraft, and the U.S. rapidly began building new installations. These included new bases at Vienois, Than Rang, Phuket, and Tua. All would see immense Super Sabre activity in the years to come. At many locations in Vietnam, pairs of 10,000-foot runways were built together with accommodation, administration, and maintenance facilities. In terms of modern airfields, South Vietnam became one of the most richly endowed nations on Earth. At the peak of their deployment, 490 F-100s were operating from South Vietnamese bases. Other units were stationed in Thailand. Aircrafts and units were rotated so that the most of the Air Force's Sabres saw action at one time or another. Even the two-seat traders arrived on the scene, to be re-equipped as the first Wild Weasel aircraft. They would soon be wreaking devastation on enemy anti-aircraft installations. In 1966, the base at Fan Run was one of the first to receive an all F-100 fighter wing. It remained a center of Super Sabre activity throughout the war. At one time, 140 operated from the field. By the middle of 1967, 4 fighter wings, the 3rd, 31st, 35th, and 37th, were operating the Hun in Vietnam. Although histories of the Vietnam Air War might make only passing reference to the F-100s, it's not because they weren't there in numbers, perhaps not as glamorous as other planes. Their contribution to the war effort was irreplaceable. In long-range strikes against North Vietnam, the Super Sabre's weakness became evident when compared to the newer F-105 and F-4. In such company, the F-100 was definitely outclassed. However, the F-100 served admirably as the aerial artillery so desperately needed by U.S. ground troops. At times, this was the most important task performed by the Air Force, especially to the grunts toughing it out below. To the F-100s operating with forward air controllers or FACs would drop their loads with devastating effect. Their missions can be described simply: briefing, takeoff, refueling, flying to a set of coordinates, rendezvousing with the FAC, locating and attacking targets, finally heading back to the base for more ordnance. A clinical description for what was a devastating endeavor. Pattern of the missions was repetitive, and those missions were flown in vast numbers. As early as 1969, the 4 wings stationed in South Vietnam had flown more combat missions than the combined total of the thousands of P-51 Mustangs engaged in World War II. The intensity never let up, and airfields in South Vietnam became the busiest in the world. In January 1967, figures for the base at Viennos showed 65,000 takeoffs and landings. This translates to 1 every 42 seconds for 31 days. Many of those were F-100s. In light of this, the word busy takes on a new and fuller meaning. As soon as the plane arrived back at base, a de-arming crew cleared the guns and reset the safety pins. Only then could the flurry of maintenance, fueling, and rearming begin. With the crew chiefs checking and rechecking the plane during the process, they were quickly readied for the next action. In practice, the Huns would fly 2 missions a day. Operational readiness figures achieved by the F-100s in Vietnam sometimes registered above 95%, which was a credit to the planes and their crews. The 31st Tactical Fighter Wing operated 5 squadrons of F-100s. This meant that its base, Tiwa, had the highest concentration of Huns in South Vietnam. In addition to its 3 regular squadrons, 2 Air National Guard squadrons were attached to it. The National Guard forces deployed to Vietnam proved to be among the most effective units in the theater, partly due to the age and experience of the pilots, and, in part, of the stability of their personnel. These squadrons shot down the old flying club image of the Air National Guard. Instead, they proved to be a strong and valuable reserve. After their performance under fire, the F-100s phased out of Guard service were replaced with brand new aircraft. In earlier days, they would have been issued hand-me-downs from the regular Air Force. In fact, General George Brown stated that the best 5 F-100 squadrons in Vietnam were National Air Guard units. These 5 included the 2 Guard units attached to the 31st Wing, Atwila, the 136th from New York, and the 188th from New Mexico. Tiwa was another of the new bases begun in May of 1966. By November of that same year, F-100s were operating from the airstrip there. Its temporary aluminum matting runway was still in use long after a concrete runway was laid beside it in 1967. The installation was finally abandoned in mid-1970. With its seemingly endless rounds of raids and replenishment, the activity of TWA wasn't much different from the other F-100 bases of the war. The 31st brought with it about 110 aircraft. 44 National Guard planes were later added, making a total of over 150 Huns. Day and night, the routines at the base went on, with the men working a minimum of 6 days a week to keep up with the deadly rotation of strikes. By the time a plane was ready for its mission, it would be loaded with fuel, ammunitions, and stores to the point where a pilot needed every inch of the airstrip just to take off. Tuy Wa's runway faced out to sea, and, with mountains at the other end of the strip, most landings and takeoff went over the beach. The view may have been nice, but variable sea breezes averaging around 25 knots and blowing across the runways tended to complicate matters. F-100 missions fell into 2 basic categories: planned strikes preceded by extensive briefings, and combat emergencies, responses to urgent calls from help from forward air controllers or army units. F-100s also joined in pilot rescue operations, sometimes providing a wall of suppressive fire encircling enemy troops. The aircraft was fast, and its bases were spread over all of South Vietnam. Planes would often be in the air and over a target within minutes. Sometimes, the men on the ground would call down strikes on only 50 yards from their own positions. This is a tribute to the planes and their pilots, because the grunts on the ground would have to be far more wary for any calling of help if the Super Sabres hadn't established a solid reputation for getting there fast and hitting only what they shot at. The need for an extreme accuracy in supporting ground troops was an additional and not inconsiderable burden on already tense pilots. Vietnam was a major testing ground for US military hardware, and some of it turned out to be terribly inadequate. The Bullpup missile was a case in point. Against entrenched targets, the toggle-controlled Bullpup wasn't much more than a nuisance, even if their aim was true. And they were less than a total success against reinforced bridges, which were just the kind of target most likely to justify their expensive use. They may have represented the cutting edge of technology one time, but in battle, they proved to a lack of cutting edge of their own. Some of the smart weaponry that showed up later was far more effective and represented a revolution in weaponry that few could have envisioned. Most of the work of the Huns was done with basic ordnance like tumbling, unfinned napalm canisters. And 500 and 750-pound iron bombs of World War II design. In addition, there were 4 cannons, each with 200 rounds, which gave the Super Sabre its lethal strafing power. By 1970, replacement of the F-100s with F-4s and F-111s was proceeding rapidly. Many of the airframes had passed 5,000 hours, and the F-100's age was telling. It had been an old design when it entered in combat, outclassed by opposing MiGs. It was simply no longer in the race as an air superiority weapon. However, it made quite a name for itself in its support of the Army and was also the first Wild Weasel aircraft. As the war drew to a close, the F-100s left Vietnam, unit by unit. The last of the 35th Tactical Wing at Thanh Rang disappeared in July 1971. Huns flew 360,283 sorties in Vietnam, more operational sorties than any other type in that war. 243 of the planes were lost, 198 of those in combat. The majority of the F-100s used in foreign air forces were second-hand. In 1958, the French were the first foreign country to receive new Super Sabres. They operated 100 of them, with 15 of the F models and 85s. These remained in French service until 1980. Denmark also had 3 squadrons of Huns and operated them until 1982, and Taiwan received and operated second-hand A models which were later upgraded. By far, the largest customer for second-hand Super Sabres was Turkey. Out of the over 300 eventually purchased, the Turks reportedly still have some F-100s in storage, but generally, the Super Sabre wasn't a great foreign sales success for North American. And, with the failure of the F-107, they were left without any fighter contracts whatsoever. But North American didn't give up on the fighter building business. On the contrary, they were already working on the Mach 3 F-108 Rapier, which, like the XP-70 Valkyrie, was to be another step into the future. In June 1957, the company was given a contract to develop a proposal that had been initiated in 1955. The plane envisaged would be an interceptor capable of operating at Mach 3 at 70,000 feet. It would have been able to fly 1,000 miles from its base, launching a missile and be back home and on the ground in half an hour. The aim was to destroy incoming missiles or bombers far out at sea. Unfortunately, the plane would have carried an enormous price tag, and after viewing the mock-up in January 1959, the Air Force backed off. On September 23, 1959, North American advised of the Rapier program's cancellation after only 3 generations, all of which had been illustrious ones. The company's days of fighter construction were at an end. After Vietnam, Huns remained in service solely with the National Guard, and by 1972 had completely phased out of the Air Force use. But almost no low-time planes were left. Having become a relic, they were gradually phased out. They had been with the Guard for over 21 years, and several pilots had logged over 5,000 flying hours in them. The last operational National Guard flight was on the 10th of November 1979. The only flights after that were ferrying operations. The F-100 is now a thing of the past. It was the product of an experimental age and bridged 2 separate eras between 1949 and 1979. A lot had happened in aviation. The plane had gone from the world record holder to a non-contender even before its production cycle was over. And although it had no fancy avionics, pilots grew to love it both for the plane it was and for the hard lessons it taught them. Among old Hun jockeys, there is little dissent about what it's worth. At one time, the subject of considerable doubt, the Super Sabre ended its career with a proud reputation, and with the distinction of its performance in Vietnam. That reputation is sure to live on for a very long time.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.